Mike, thank you so much for joining me. I'm excited to talk to you because I feel like you have a unique perspective across journalism and climate, especially at this crazy time in America and in the world that is so important. Mike Coren is a technology and business reporter for Quartz here in San Francisco. He has also worked across science and technology in the startup world, and most recently founded Hothouse, so which I wanted to give him a little space to talk about. But before we dive into that, I wanted to ask you, you've been a journalist for a while. How have you seen the field shift in the last year, and even in the last few weeks?
Um, I think, thanks for having me on. This is great. And I'd love to talk about this stuff. We're both working on, similar problems. So as for journalism, it's been a wild ride actually since I got into the business. It's just some years are more crazy than others, and this has been one of the craziest. I think the meta shift that's happening is sort of the rise of independent media and the rise of independent voices that aren't even part of the established media, and we're seeing that with things like what we're doing with Hothouse. So that's a Substack newsletter movement, but also just with the social media and just the explosion of different platforms and different channels that has fractured the media landscape, but also reality in a way that we've never seen before. So if I had to pick one trend, that would probably be it. But there are others. Certainly, climate change is now a topic that, in a topic of concern, when in a way has never been before.
You and I met, I think, almost a year ago now, just before the pandemic really set in.
That's right.
And in the context of actually, I think it was the first My Climate Journey in person event that we went to here in San Francisco.
Yeah.
How did climate become important to you personally?
So I've always been interested in the environment. I was going to be a scientist actually, and spent a lot of time in the lab. I think my first science project, was the bacterial microflora of Cyanopsis ocellatus before and after freshwater immersion. So I spent a year studying, basically dipping fish in fresh water to understand how it affected their bacterial microflora. Anyways, so I decided not to do lab. That wasn't for me, but I did fall in love with science and the environment, and that has always been a passion. When I was at Emory, an undergraduate, I studied ecology, and you start to understand the world as an interconnected system of which we are just a part. And then I went to CNN, and I was their science producer, and decided to do a special on climate change. And I'd never done that before, and that was a topic that I just barely knew about. So I checked out a book, I read it, and I realized, this was going to be one of the defining challenges of our generation, although it seemed so big and so distant that
Mm.
it didn't have the urgency yet. I just knew it was going to be so important. And then in graduate school was when things, I think, became very real very quickly, because it was almost like watching a preview. You had access to the latest science, the most knowledgeable people, and almost without exception, the level of alarm and just deep sadness that they had about what was coming was inescapable. And so it was very bittersweet to suddenly be there and learn about this, and then realize we were losing almost everything that we wanted. And then most recently it reaffirmed it with the sort of our own personal apocalypse in San Francisco, with the orange skies and the fire season this year. And every year just gets more and more urgent. So that's been a very abbreviated version of the journey that I've been on.
I think that probably resonates with a lot of people of feeling this sort of mounting sense of anxiety around the climate crisis, something we've known about maybe for a while in the back of our heads, but the urgency and relevance of it is becoming even more apparent in the current world. I'm curious, how do you help people think about the link between their actions and the sort of systemic nature of the crisis? This is something at Joro we obviously think a lot about, of helping people understand their personal role and power, but also how it fits into a systemic and collective problem. How do you think about the role of people in addressing the climate crisis?
It's a great question. Well, first, it's important to acknowledge that a lot of these problems are systematic, that it is hard to avoid emitting fossil fuels as a member of society, just doing our daily lives. And there's a lot to be done at that level. At the same time, without bottom up and personal change, um, it is very hard to get the systematic level change that we're looking for. Um, so in some ways, you could argue it's symbolic to not throw away plastics and to reduce your carbon footprint through flights or transportation. But in fact, it does add up, and those numbers do have an effect. What I do think is actually more important is that as we bring our lives and align in values with our ambitions, with our hopes for what the world is going to be, we actually change our identity and we actually make political change possible. The cognitive dissonance of living our lives knowing that we are sort of profligately wasting or jeopardizing our future is so great that it often leads to denial and to the sense that we can't do anything. When we start to make changes, however small, the bigger changes become possible. And so I think it's a combination of like actual hard numbers of those small things adding up, as well as the 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 change in identity and sense of possibility that happens when we make those changes.
Hmm, that's so interesting. I feel like Corda, what you're describing is the importance of communication and sort of collective storytelling around, identity isn't something that only comes from the actions we might choose to take in our own lives, but also how we see ourselves as connected to others or to the society we live in, our community. What did you I want to talk about Hothouse a little bit and why you started it and what you think is missing or is needed in climate communication and climate journalism.
Yeah. Um, so I think what we do really well is cover the problem. People know climate change is a problem. There are only 15% of the United States that either is dismissive or doubtful at this point. So that's a big percentage of the US population. Um, and for a while, that was an issue, was knowledge. That is, I don't think, any longer the case. And
Hmm.
the theory or the idea that if we just had more facts, then things would change in this case, I don't think is true. What is true is that we need, as you said, communication, but even more so community. So this idea that we are both in this together, that we can act and we can have an impact. I think a lot of coverage is disempowering because it basically pulls us out of any sort of agency and just ascribes it to institutions or politicians or someone else. And like other movements in the past, and like almost any change that's ever happened, it comes from individuals and groups of people who decide enough is enough
Hmm.
and the time has come. And I think here, that is what we're trying to do or contribute in some way around climate change, which is this idea that you can actually cover the solutions and that we can play a role in those solutions. And that if we personally can't do those, then we can demand that we as a society start to do them. I guess our enemy is apathy and denial.
Hmm. That's really interesting. How do you how do you think about I mean in your last newsletter you covered something that you called, I think, climate despair, and often we can feel this overwhelming sense of anxiety and grief associated with climate change that causes us to shut down, potentially the over description of the problem. How can people turn that grief into action?
Yeah. So I think first we need to recognize that it exists, that what we're feeling is climate apathy, really anxiety or despair. And it's, for many people, myself included at times, it's this knowledge that's too terrible for us to consciously grapple with. Either we dismiss it or we ignore it.
Mm.
And in fact, what is happening is that our intellectual knowledge of knowing something is fueling this emotional, this denial. And we do need to essentially like confront that and accept it. And from what I've read and from what I've researched in my interviews with psychologists, is that what we're trying to do is actually achieve a degree of grief, a degree of sorrow, a degree of acceptance about what has happened and what will happen, and use that to then to do something about that future. Because hope is not lost. Like this is a solvable problem. And
Hmm.
that's actually, I think, what the more interesting story here is, that even if we've locked in 1 or 1.5 degrees of warming, which we most likely have, that's a lot less than what we could lock in. And we have today the money, the technology, and the people to actually keep that at 1.5. Um, Obviously, things need to happen to realize that, but it is eminently possible. But obviously, we are not on that trajectory. And so the question is, how do we accept sort of that grief, accept that knowledge, sit with it, and any Buddhist practitioner will immediately read this will resonate with, and then move on and move past with it, and even do so with joy, and
Mm.
with an acceptance of the challenge ahead. So that's what I'm personally trying to do with this, and what I hope to learn through the process of Hothouse, and hopefully have other people join.
I think it's so important and so helpful to just acknowledge that feeling that many of us might grapple with personally in the back of our heads. I think the first time I heard someone articulate the concept of climate anxiety, I felt a sense of relief because it's so like just reassuring to know that this isn't just you. There's something real happening here that you're grappling with that is actually a lot of people are dealing with. And as you said, there's so much I think we can learn from mindfulness, meditation, and either other, even other types of difficult practices that we do in trying to carry forward action, even in the face of something that we acknowledge is difficult.
Yeah. I mean, we're not, Western society is really bad at accepting um, discomfort, let alone mortality, and the idea that progress will not continue indefinitely along with our quality of life. And so it's really actually empowering, and as you said, a relief to be honest and use that as the starting point to do something better. So yeah, from whatever stripe of background or political persuasion you are, I think this is actually a very helpful thing to come to grips with, and then to move past.
Yeah. Some language that we're starting to use at Joro is thinking about our climate action practice and thinking about, all of us have somewhere we're starting from, some emissions within our control that can give us a sense of agency or power by choosing to align the emissions within our control with our values. But then we also have to acknowledge there's a portion of emissions that are outside of our direct control. And for that, there are more systemic actions or political actions
Yep.
um, that we and using our voice that we have to try to engage with. So trying to think about this as something it's not something you can check off your list every day necessarily, but you can build a practice of thinking about it, acknowledging it, and making progress.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, everyone's going to find sort of what works for them and what path. And so I don't want to be too prescriptive. What we try to do, at least at Hothouse, is give people the stories that help them understand sort of the nature of the problem and then the pathways for the solution. And people pick up what they can and carry that forward.
I want to maybe close with a recognition of where we are right now in the US and a lot of the difficult challenges that we're dealing with as a society and understanding civil rights and the rights of underrepresented groups, especially for racial equality and social justice in the US. And I'm curious, how do you see these climate justice and racial justice as interconnected? And what can the climate movement learn from civil rights?
It's a great question. I mean, I think in terms of what they share, and what they have in common, the civil rights movement and the climate movement both aim to protect the most vulnerable and the future of all of us. And in that, I think that they are, completely aligned. Um, and that without freedom and justice for any group, there will be not for any. And without security and a stable climate for any group, there will not be for any of us. Where they differ, according to Margaret Klein Solomon, is a clinical psychologist, is in their tactics. And the civil rights movement, and as with the climate movement, the target was denial. And with the civil rights movement, the target of denial was racism at the core of US American society. And it remains in many cases the case. The solution or the approach to that denial was a non-violent civil rights movement that put the dignity of the people who were fighting for their rights at the front and center until it was undeniable that the injustice of what was happening at U.S. society, and that racism was a real thing for millions and millions of Americans. With the climate challenge, the denial is actually about the biggest obstacle is actually about anxiety, and overcoming that despair and anxiety at the core of the movement. And so how do we move past it? And that's actually going to be the question. Do civil rights tactics work as well? Perhaps protests, marches, but it actually, we need to find a positive movement of ways to move people forward through their grief towards action. They already know climate change is happening. How do they accept it emotionally? And then what can they do next?
Mm, that is so interesting. I think acknowledging that both movements are trying to protect the most vulnerable and the populations that are not protected maybe by the primary groups in power is a really interesting connection, but maybe that the solutions aren't the same, and an acknowledgement that sort of the path to a cleaner, more climate just society might not be the same as the path to a racially just society as well.
That's very possible, and I think we will still see a massive popular uprising and movement in marches and protests and sit-ins, and civil disobedience is an invaluable tool. But I do think that is not enough, and what's needed is the ability to give people a plan and hope to act. And I
Mm,
don't think they have that right now. I think people feel disempowered and distanced from this. And unless we change that idea, I don't think we're going to see the political and personal action that we need to have. And so that is the challenge of what you're doing. And I think what I'm doing and what everyone is going to be doing in the next 10 to 20 years.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us. Everyone who is tuning in, thank you as well. If you're feeling activated and motivated by this conversation to go do something on climate, go subscribe to Hothouse to get some inspiration and stories in your inbox, or download Joro to start taking action. Thank
We're
you
at
so much.
hothouse.solutions.
Hothouse.solutions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Stop recording.